Hello, everyone. So, something I get asked a lot is how do I get into Kamen Rider? What is a good series to start with? And I give the same answers and I've been giving the same answer for years, but I don't know if I've ever really dedicated it to a video. At least not as a video intended to tell people which Rider series to start with. And I definitely haven't described like why to avoid certain other series. So I guess this is the video to do that. And thankfully, getting into Kamen Rider in 2022 is actually a lot easier than it used to be, and a lot harder too. Easier because, well, I can just tell you to go watch Zero One. If you want the Blu-ray, that's available with full official subs. And if you want to try out Kamen Rider without really any investment, it's free on Tubi. Can't beat can't beat that. Can't beat it's just that easy now. Zero One is a nice series. It's not in my top five, but it's still a solid show. There's a really strong character dynamic in the center. And aside from so there's a stretch of like a 10 episode stretch that gets really dull, and then toward the end it got really rushed, and that was all like pandemic lockdown stuff. However, I do think it pulled through and became a really nice series with really nice designs and really strong characters. I like Zero One. I like Zero One a lot. So it's not a bad one to be your first time. Let's say you watch Zero One and you want to continue. You liked it and you want to see something else. Or maybe it wasn't quite your thing, but you like the style and you want to see if a different flavor of Kamen Rider would work for you. You're going to know already that they all exist subtitled out there somewhere on the internet. And you would ask, TJOmega, where do I find Kamen Rider online that is not Zero One? And I have an answer for you. No, I'm not giving you that. I'm not risking my channel to save you a Google search. All I'm going to say is you can find it. And that's where we're going to leave that. However, if you were to look into other Kamen Riders, or in the fantasy world where they start releasing all of those old Heisei Kamen Rider shows in whatever way, Tubi, Blu-ray, what have you. Let's say you have a plethora to choose from someday. Let's hypothetically go over your options here. Now, for starters, a lot of people are going to tell you to start with Kamen Rider Decade, and they're going to tell you that because Decade gives you this little sampler of all these different Kamen Riders from the first half of the Heisei period. And that's a good idea in premise, but I very, very sternly warn against Decade as a first Rider series. For starters, there are plot issues to Decade. Even if you like Decade, and I do, I have to admit, there's some massive plot problems with it. It doesn't really tell a great story. It's just a really cool experience. That's what Decade is. And it's better appreciated when you know more of other writers. What's really the reason to avoid Decade as your first is because Decade's little 2 episode story arcs focusing on each writer, occasionally they would use the major plot twist of that writer's series as their 2 episode storyline, which meant you spoiled the best reveal in the show. So if you're watching it to figure out which series you want, you could likely spoil the best part of it, and all that build up and drama and mystery and intrigue and etc. that they were building up in the full-length series is pointless to you. So, not Decade. Decade is not a first-time writer series for anyone. I like it, but you can do better. So people will ask me, what was your first? Which one did you start with? Well, I started with Kamen Rider Kiva because the design struck me so hard. I loved the look and the style that Kiva was going for. I wouldn't recommend it to a beginner unless you really like the classic movie monster aesthetics they got going on, because it is a time travel style series where you're dealing with a storyline happening in the past and a storyline happening in the present. And sometimes it can get kind of convoluted, and sometimes it can get hard to follow when they keep switching back and forth between the two. It's a interesting storytelling system, but it does mean that half the cast never interacts with the other half of the cast, which is a little bit odd. You're following basically two shows at the same time. So it's not a bad show. I think it gets a bad rap sometimes, but it's definitely one that's hard to recommend to a beginner. How about Agito? That's my favorite Kamen Rider series. I tell people that a lot. If you've watched this channel for any length of time, you should know that. Agito is not a beginner's series. It's an older style Heisei series, which means it's darker, it's grittier, the effects aren't as flashy, the fight scenes are not quite as like fast paced and it's like super polished. If you like the more practical effects side of things, it's definitely a show that you'll enjoy seeing. And if you like mystery stories, I love the mystery story that Agito tells because it just keeps pulling you along and keeps asking you more questions. I think that's what a good mystery story should do, and Agito does it exceptionally well. Happens to have my favorite writer of all time in there too. However, again, it's not the kind of flavor I would recommend for a beginner. For a beginner, get something easy under your belt and then look into some of the more involved series. Like figure out what you like first to see if Agito's the direction you want to go into. That's where I would go. Similarly, something that is also a big favorite of mine that has more of those modern aesthetics to it is Gaim. Gaim is a really good story. Gaim is a huge cast of characters and no one feels useless. No one feels like they're there just to sell a toy. Everyone has a purpose to the plot. Everyone feels important in one way or another. It's an extremely well-balanced series. And yeah, awesome scenes, modern effects, modern gimmick systems. So you actually kind of understand what Rider is about these days and has been about since basically Kamen Rider Double. So you get a much more modern aesthetic and modern sensibility to it. Gaim is a hard one to approach and sell people on because you have to get people behind the idea of fruit samurais. That's that's the jumping on point. If you tell them there is a knight dressed like a banana and they are into it, by all means, go for Gaim. Uh, Gaim is a well-balanced storyline series. It gets really dark and heavy at times. But it's a progression to that point that makes it really, really good. And it's one of those series that doesn't have like a spot in the middle where it kind of like chugs and like 01 does. It just keeps ramping. So, good show. Maybe hard to get people in on the basic concept. I'd say the same thing of X-Aid. X-Aid's a really solid series with really, really strong characters, but it's that aesthetic. It's the goofier, very bright neon 90s aesthetic they went for. The level 1 writers especially, it might be hard to get anyone to take the show seriously as soon as they see the first henshin. If you can get them through that, and get them through the idea of doctors playing video games as a theme, then you're good. Then you might be onto something. But it is just one of those other series where the concept is so weird, it might be hard to approach for some people. Now, you might be wondering, do I start at the beginning? And if we're talking Heisei Kamen Rider, that would be Kuga. I wouldn't recommend Kuga for a beginner because it is still, again, it is the first Heisei series. It's, again, in that darker, grittier tone. There really isn't as much humor to cut through the seriousness. There's no real levity to the series. It's just dramatic, all the way through. And you get and it is a slower paced series with less going on because it's a single rider the entire time. No secondaries whatsoever. It's still got a lot of those old Showa era mentalities to it. So it is classic in that way. And it's overall a good series, but it's not one that I would tell people to start with. Because if you're going to move on to any other Kamen Rider, there's going to be a major shift to the dynamic. I think it's better appreciated when you see what Rider has become. And if you enjoy that, go see what it used to be. And then you have I think a point of comparison makes it a little bit more interesting to watch. So for me, if I'm recommending a Kamen Rider series to somebody, It's always about three names, the ones that I give out the most when I tell people these are the ones you need to be watching. So for starters, if you, I usually compare it based on your taste in anime, because the storytelling style naturally for one Japanese media is going to be similar to another. So we start at that baseline. If you like a more comedic series, especially in your anime, try Den-O. Den-O is a really fun show. People rag on it because mostly because it's so overplayed. It was a massive money maker for Toei, so they just kept doing more Den-O. They kept pushing Den-O in merchandise, and they kept shoving Den-O cameos into everything they could from in modern series and movies. But it is legitimately a fun writer series. And yeah, it's time travel, but not too heavy time travel to make your head hurt kind of time travel. So I think it hits a nice little balance. And it is, again, it's a much more cartoony, lighthearted series. There's nothing really heavy going on to Den-O. So if you like some more comedic elements, that would be my suggestion. A secondary to that would probably be Forze. Forze is probably the most lighthearted writer series. It's a very low stakes writer series. Not a whole lot of drama going on. It's high school hijinks mostly. So, soft series is what I would call it. I would recommend Den-O more though, if that's what you're into. If you want dramatic, let's talk Kabuto. This was technically the first Kamen Rider series I ever saw. I saw one random episode completely out of context, thought to myself, I don't get it. I don't see the point. I don't see the appeal. And now, here I am. But Kabuto is another really solid show that I really, really enjoy. Very strong cast of characters. Like Kagami, especially, I think has a really strong story arc. Tendo is just such a glorious bastard style hero. Very, very enjoyable to watch in that. Super confident hero. I like that from time to time. It is much more dramatic. There's not quite as much levity, but when the levity hits, it is really hard. So the contrast is nice, but it is a more serious writer show with more serious aesthetics. So if that's what you're into, you can try that out. A secondary one to that in current Heisei stuff. I'm trying to think of a good one offhand because levity became I'm trying to recommend something where levity was not a big thing, but in Neo Heisei, the second half of Heisei, pretty much every writer series has some comedy level to it. There's none that's just oh yeah, we're taking it seriously this year. Drive has comedic characters, even though at the core it's serious. I'd say the same of Gaim. I'd say the same of. I'm trying to think of them all offhand. Same as Build. Let's put it that way. I think Build is one that's kind of like a modern comparable to Kabuto. All right. And then middle of the road. If you're not quite sure and you just want a middle of the road Kamen Rider series, it's still really good characters, and still gives you an idea of the style Kamen Rider goes for, mostly with the aesthetic style of all those different collectibles they have to work into the story. Go watch O's. If Agito's number 1 on my list and Gaim is number 2, then O's is number 3. I love the characters in this. They have really good character arcs to them. Eiji, I think, makes a really cool hero character. He's not one of those who's natural with his powers either. He kind of learns as he goes. Ankh is a really fascinating character. The Greed are really cool characters. And it's interesting to see the constant power play between the Greed villains and O's himself as they vie for the same power sources and trade back and forth so often. It makes for a really interesting dynamic because it feels like O's never quite has all of his abilities at once, and that kind of puts him on the back foot sometimes, and that's not a bad thing. Makes it more interesting. So O's is a nice middle ground. If you just want any writer series to watch, you're not sure what to do, O's. Just don't watch the 10th anniversary movie. I'm still not over that. And any advice beyond that is just take a look at the basic designs and themes and just try it out. Every writer series is completely different from each other. Every year, new story, new gimmicks, new characters, new cast, new location, new everything. So there's really no fault in whichever direction you go in. Except Ghost. Don't ever start with Ghost. Don't finish with Ghost either, for that matter. So that's going to be my general recommendations, just so they're out in the world. I've been meaning to do something like this for a long time, and might do something way more in-depth down the road, but for now, I think this makes for a nice general, like, this is how to approach Kamen Rider. So hopefully you got something out of this. I wish you well in your tokusatsu journey, and let me know if you end up trying out a series. Let me know what you thought. I'm genuinely curious, because I love getting people into this idea of, spandex armor-wearing bug men fighting aliens, robots, and monsters. I think it's fun. Guys, I am facing the most powerful enemy any YouTuber can face, the algorithm, and I need your help to defeat him. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment. Every time you do, we attack that algorithm and we drive it back until it can no longer defeat this channel. Thank you very much.